Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump is vacationing in Bedminster, New Jersey, but his Twitter feed takes aim at policy both here and abroad. At 5:30 Tuesday morning, he tweeted a global warning saying, quote, anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. The U.S. reinstated some sanctions Tuesday after pulling out of the 2015 nuclear deal back in May. Just an hour later, the president tweeted in support of a Republican candidate running in Ohio's special election Tuesday, saying Troy Balderson would be a great congressman. One topic the president has stayed away from so far is what he calls the rigged witch hunt. It's day 6 of former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort's fraud trial and day 2 of testimony from the government's star witness Rick Gates. Gates is Manafort's former business associate. On Monday, he told jurors he and Manafort broke the law together. On Tuesday, the prosecution questioned him about the Trump campaign. David Nakamura covers the White House for the Washington Post, and Tamara Keith covers the White House for NPR. They join me now from Washington. Welcome to you both. David, let me start with you. Has anything from Paul Manafort's trial been damaging to President Trump so far?
You know, the guilt by association with Paul Manafort is something that obviously the president's been concerned about. He's made clear, and it is true, that this trial does not center on Manafort's time as the Trump campaign chairman. President Trump, as you know, has tried to distance himself from Manafort, said he's only worked on my campaign for a few months, short amount of time, even though obviously he was a key player. No, the focus of this trial is Manafort's private business consulting with officials in Ukraine and other states, and actions that he allegedly took to conceal revenue from the federal government and defraud the federal government for purposes of avoiding taxes. And, you know, so Rick Gates' testimony as a right-hand man, both in his private consulting business and, of course, later on the Trump campaign, has been very sort of revealing and potentially damaging to Manafort. But for now, it does not reflect directly on Trump.
And Tamara, I know we have a somewhat limited window into this, but how much attention has the president or people around him, how much attention have they been paying to this trial, you think?
And we do have a limited window into this, but what we do know is that last week, as the trial was getting going, President Trump was tweeting a lot about what he called the witch hunt, and what he continues to call the witch hunt. So, you know, the president is a consumer of media, and there's been a lot of media focus on this, so it's pretty unlikely that he's avoiding it. It's also pretty unlikely that he is trying to avoid it.
Well, and so, David, on Monday, it's interesting. The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, told your colleague, Robert Costa, at the Washington Post, that Donald Trump's legal team is planning to send a letter to the special counsel this week rebuffing their latest offer of a presidential interview that would include questions about possible obstruction of justice. David, what are the risks of pushing this interview off, both legally and politically?
Well, you know, Trump, it's interesting because as is not uncommon with Trump and his advisors, there seems to be something of a split in opinion about how to move forward. I mean, Trump keeps saying this is a witch hunt, this is an unfair, you know, sort of politically minded assault on his sort of entire presidency that aims to undermine him, and that he wants it to wrap up, and that it's time for this to be over. And one way to do that would be for the president potentially to answer questions and try to put this to bed. But obviously his attorneys, including Rudy Giuliani, are very concerned about the president potentially saying something in an interview with Mueller that contradicts what he said publicly about a number of issues, including the firing of former FBI Director Comey. And so there's a lot of risk for the president to move forward, but there also is a potential risk for him to put it off. Obviously, politically, to say that he's hiding something, that he's not forthright as much as he says he has nothing to hide. And obviously, you know, we don't know exactly the extent to what Mueller has found, made all his findings public, but it would be a chance for the president, if he did address these, you know, allegations in private, to try to answer some of them more fully. And so could be a chance for him to sort of have his say. But it looks unlikely that the president is going forward anytime soon.
Yeah, Tamara, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is a risk that prosecutors could lose their patience, that they could at some point try to force the issue, try to force a conversation, which could lead to, you know, a massive fight between the president's legal team and Mueller's team. We don't have any insight into what Mueller's team is planning or would consider? Because, well, they don't talk; they're very quiet on purpose. But certainly there is a risk that if the president's team puts off Mueller's team too long, either they could come forward with a report that doesn't have the president's point of view in it, or they could try to force the president to testify or to have a conversation, and that could get interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, Tamara, especially when you consider that these negotiations have been going on for months. I recall being here last year, towards the end of last year, people talked about perhaps something being imminent then. And here we are, 2018 in August, and still talking about these negotiations. Well, Tamara, we know that the 2016 Trump Tower meeting is something else that Bob Mueller is interested in. The president tweeted about it over the weekend, saying he knew nothing about it. Is the special counsel, Tamara, interested in this because of what happened at that meeting, you think, or because of what was said about it years later?
Can I say both? Yeah. Obviously, if the special counsel is investigating Russian interference in the presidential election and Russian individuals met with people from one of the presidential campaigns, from President Trump's presidential campaign, that's germane to their investigation in a big way. But then also, President Trump helped craft, dictated the statement that Donald Trump Jr. initially put out about the meeting, saying that, it was just about adoption. As an obstruction of justice case is potentially built, there is something to be seen in why were they trying to hide sort of the original intent of the meeting or the premise under which the meeting was set up, which was, according to the emails Donald Trump Jr. he ultimately released himself, to get dirt on Hillary Clinton.
And that Trump himself on his tweet just a couple days ago, in reaction to a Washington Post story that said he was privately expressing concern that Don Jr., although Trump didn't think he was guilty of anything colluding with the Russians, might be exposing himself to legal jeopardy by just being involved in any of this. Trump then wrote on Twitter, of course, that the purpose of the meeting was not, in fact, to deal with the issue of Russian adoptions, but, in fact, was to gather information on the Clinton campaign, potentially, which he said was not a crime.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating because you can almost track the media consumption habits of the president based on that Twitter feed, almost in real time,
Always.
right? Well, let's turn to foreign policy here. President Trump, David, says that he is asking for, quote, nothing less than world peace, end quote, when it comes to reinstating sanctions on Iran. Now, they were lifted as part of a multinational nuclear deal with Iran. What do these sanctions look like?
Well, this is the first wave of the reimposition of these sanctions that Barack Obama had lifted, along with the other 5 nations that had struck the nuclear deal with Iran. And Trump has made, clear from his campaign through the start of his presidency that he wanted to overturn this. He was talked out of it the initial months by his advisors to give it more time to figure out if they could do something to renegotiate parts of the deal with Iran. That did not happen, and Trump has now gone forward, and he's surrounded in the White House by a number of sort of uber hawks on Iran, from National Security Advisor John Bolton and others. And these first set of sanctions basically limit Iran's ability to do business around the world in U.S. dollars, sort of block the importing of certain Iranian goods to the United States and other trade issues. And the president is now saying, as you mentioned in his tweets, trying to call on other nations to follow suit, but that is not happening. And Iran is now sort of flaunting the idea that they're moving forward with the European partners, with China, other big trade partners, to keep doing business. And those countries have made clear that they intend to try to keep the general confines of the nuclear deal in place as best they can to keep Iran sort of cooperating. But so it sets up a real, sort of loggerheads, not just between the U.S. and Iran, but the U.S. and other partners.
And Tamara, what is the administration's ultimate goal? What does it appear to be in putting these sanctions back in place?
Well, they would say that what they want is for Iran to stop its bad behavior around the world. They also talk in ways that makes it seem pretty clear that they're also interested in regime change, though they don't necessarily use those words. They say that they don't have a complaint with the Iranian people. They have a complaint with the Iranian regime. They spend a lot of time talking about the protests that have happened in Iran, sort of saying, hey, that's not a bad thing. Let's promote those protests that are happening. So it's sort of a fascinating dynamic, especially given President Trump's great criticism of the Obama administration's support of so-called regime change, to now have the Trump administration, at least on some level, talking about that very thing, wanting an uprising of the people of Iran. The other thing is that within the administration, Jared Kushner is very closely allied with people in Saudi Arabia and people and leaders in Israel, and those are two nations that have zero interest in the U.S. having friendly relations or even working relations with Iran.
No, it's an excellent point. And David, in the meantime, the president says that sanctions will, quote, ratchet up to yet another level in November. What will those look like?
It does. Those will deal with Iranian oil imports, which is obviously an important source of revenue to that country. But, you know, what's interesting is people have compared this gambit by President Trump to what he did with North Korea last year, where he sort of ramped up sanctions, had this tough rhetoric, really tough rhetoric about Kim Jong-un. And that basically set up an opening for a summit that sort of, appeared to diffuse tensions to some degree. We don't know if there's any progress on the nuclear, denuclearization in North Korea. But people say, oh, this is the same sort of strategy. He's going to sort of ramp up the stakes and then try to meet with the Iranian leadership and come to some sort of, deal that he could sell to the public as some sort of progress. But what's different here, is that the risks could be higher. They're not, Iran is not a nuclear power. It's more of a regional power that threatens regional actors. And the president is surrounded by these hawks on Iran. So some fear that this could lead to some greater escalation beyond just sanctions and war of words that could, potentially be some sort of military conflict. We're not there yet, but that opens up a whole other possibility.
Let's turn to domestic politics here. President Trump is on vacation, as we've mentioned, but he is still tweeting about some of Tuesday's elections. I want to get both your takes on this. If Democrats, Tamara, do well tonight, how should we interpret that for President Trump?
It would be a very big problem for President Trump if, in particular, in this Ohio special election that is a solidly Republican seat, if by some chance the Democrat is able to win that seat, and I think really in terms of the headlines, it probably would have to be a win for the Democrat for the president to get a real headache out of this. But if the Democrat were to win after Republicans have spent a huge amount of money, after President Trump went to the district and held a rally as sort of a rescue mission, that would be a very big problem for the president and for Republicans in terms of the message, in terms of sending a message to Republicans around the country, and it would be a real energizer for Democrats, of course. But we have to remember this has been a very consistently, solidly Republican seat.
David, how do you see it? Because some people might argue, well, August, it's tough. Yeah. In that Ohio district, you've had voters now, you're asking them to come out to the polls for, it'll be 3 times, really. So
sure.
The notion that, okay, one particular race might be something that we should interpret as reflecting poorly on the president is maybe putting too much weight on it.
I think that is. It's hard to draw sweeping conclusions for November right now on this one race, but the president has lost some other in races where he's endorsed Republican candidates. And I think what's interesting and what I'm hearing from talking to people is if there is a Democratic victory or even a Democrat there comes close in that race, would the president consider, going with his instincts? And what I mean by that is he's talked about, a fight over the border wall, potentially shutting down the government if he doesn't get the money for the wall. Issues that play to the base but alarm Republican leadership because they fear that it'll rebound more broadly with suburban voters and other more moderate sectors of the Republican electorate and really, hurt the Republicans in November. Trump thinks it could be a winner. And, would he be convinced to sort of go with his instincts and take this hardline approach, that he worked for him in 2016 and he could believe would work for him in the midterms if he feels like the turnout tonight was not what he expected?
All right, we are going to be watching it all. David Nakamura and Tamara Keith, great to have your insight. Thanks to you both.
You're
Thanks
welcome.